Hi, I'm Dan Calacci, and I'm a PhD student at the Media Lab at MIT. And today I want to talk to you about a project that I've worked on in collaboration with Willies Story, who is a gig worker organizer, and Drew Ambrogi, who is a labor advocate, as well as my advisor, Sandy Pentland, where we did a collective collaborative audit of a gig platform's change from a transparent pay scheme to a black box algorithm that was then used to pay delivery workers. And we did this by developing an SMS chatbot that aggregated worker pay together, gave workers feedback about their pay and how the algorithm was affecting them, and then aggregated it and analyzed it to look at how the algorithmic change has been impacting worker pay over time and overall. And this is really, for me, an example of a project that was worker-led. The workers, and Willie in particular, were not just participants in the design of the project, but the research was initiated by them. And my role in the project was really to take it, scale it, and turn those questions into more formal research questions that could be answered using statistical and quantitative methods. And if you read the paper, you'll see that I go into how this is an extension of some historical concepts in labor history, and also the importance of these notions, I think, for the future of worker-led research and the CSCW community as a whole. To really explain this, I want to introduce you to Willie. Willie is a gig worker. He worked for Shipt starting in 2019. Shipt is Target's delivery company. And back in 2019, the pay for Shipt was good and really liked working for him. It was $5 per order plus 7.5% of whatever the customer was paying for the order would go to the driver as their order pay. Predictable and simple. Then in early 2020, Willie started noticing something. People were posting on Facebook forums, groups, about their pay changing and it not matching up with that scheme. Not knowing why, not knowing how their pay was shifting, not knowing if they were making more or less, although many people were suspecting they were making less. And Willie started asking some questions. Willie wanted to know things like if the two payment schemes were different. He wanted to know who was being affected and if it was impacting certain places over others. And most importantly, he wanted to know if he would be affected by this payment scheme change and how it would actually impact his pay. To answer them, he started, collecting a data set. He started talking with over 600, 650 workers about just their experiences with Shipt, with the algorithm as a gig worker generally. And then he started collecting pay data from workers. And the way that he did this was to collect screenshots to document any changes to their pay that happened over time. Workers would text Willie these screenshots, and Willie would put them into a spreadsheet. And this was all on his phone. And he shared this spreadsheet with Drew, a labor advocate, who then connected me to the project. And really quickly, Willie was just totally overwhelmed by this data collection. He really didn't have enough time to do the data collection and his work. And so we worked with Willie and with Drew to figure out a way to take his research method and inquiry, his project, scale it, and automate it. As an engineer, it was very clear to me that what Willie was doing could be, automated. So we developed a OCR tool that would scrape these screenshots, turn it into machine-readable data about order pay, the amount of tip that was in the order, when the order was, everything that's sort of inside of these pay receipts. And it's important to note that this is not data that you can just export into CSV as a worker. They make it intentionally difficult to access this pay history data. So this was really the most convenient way for workers to export it, was taking screenshots and scrolling through their pay history. Now, one of the things that I know in the paper that's important to acknowledge here is that the process of how the actual bot worked, where people would send these screenshots and then get back information about their pay, was crucially important. Workers, although they were motivated by the sort of altruistic notion of participating in a research project or contributing to advocacy, really just wanted to know about their own pay, how it was changing, how this new algorithm would affect them, how their pay compared to others. And so it was crucial that the bot incorporated some of those incentives into its structure, which we did by creating some commands that workers could use to get different kinds of information from the bot. Even the text that we used was co-developed with workers and with Willie in particular to really engage with folks and make sure that they understood what was happening and they had a clear idea of what kinds of information and value they could get from participating in the project. After collecting several hundred screenshots, piloting it, rolling it out, and then collecting pretty comprehensive pay history from over 200 workers, we narrowed down our data set to around 140 workers in total who provided consistent pay history during this pay shift and started doing our analysis. The first thing that we saw, sort of surprisingly, was that the V2 algorithm was paying more overall on average. This was Shipt's narrative. This is what they would say, is that V2, which is the new algorithmic pay scheme, was paying more on average for all workers. But it wasn't the complete picture. When we disaggregated that by worker, we saw that there was a consistent subpopulation of workers that was getting underpaid, paid less than they were before under the new scheme. And this wasn't just, a tiny pay cut. This amounted to, if we looked at hourly pay, between $1 to $3 an hour for a chunk of workers, about 40% of workers that we studied as part of this project. That's not nothing. It's quite significant, especially when you consider how close hourly payment with these systems is to state minimum wage laws, which workers are not subjected to because they're contractors and not wage workers. But the crucial point here is not that the algorithm was bad or that it was the wrong move for Shipt to take. It's really that this is information that should be made available to workers on these platforms to begin with. Without understanding the totality of how this algorithm impacts their pay, workers can't make informed choices about what platforms they work for and when. There are a lot of contributions that are included in the paper that I don't go into here in this talk. For one, this is the first major crowdsourced collective audit of a gig platform pay algorithm. I really think of this as a first step or a prototype for future work. This is also, which I go into more detail in the paper, a good example of worker-led research. Not just participatory design, but research that was conceived of and started by workers themselves or community themselves, and then taken up and contributed to by academics in order to solve the questions and answer the questions that workers themselves had. And then the last main contribution here that I think about is that it's an example of how aggregate worker data, which is difficult to collect now for gig workers and other workers, is really needed to provide transparency in marketplaces with algorithmic pay or any kind of data-driven mechanisms behind it. Workers did not have the full story of how this algorithm worked, and aggregating this data and doing this analysis was the only meaningful way to provide workers with a more complete picture. Thanks.